Welcome to this question and answer session with Bruce Thornton, independent consultant and trainer. Bruce developed the risk model several years ago with David Paul of Gwynedd Council. Bruce has introduced the risk model to authorities across Wales and England over the last 10 years. In this conversation, we focus on the importance of strengths in child protection. Bruce introduces the idea of relevant strengths during the conversation. Bruce, can you talk a little about the importance of strengths in child protection?
I think it's important to start by saying that strengths in child protection needs to be thought about differently to strengths generally. There's a lot of talk about strengths and strengths-based practice. We see it in legislation and procedures. We see it across the continuum of need. It is seen these days as one of the foundations of good practice. I think that it's useful and appropriate. So when we're thinking about our own practice, I'm sure you're thinking, how can I be a great child protection practitioner and incorporate strengths into my child protection work? However, I'll ask you to exercise a little caution. I'll ask you not to think about strengths, but to think of relevant strengths. It's easier to work from a strengths perspective in adult services or in early intervention. The capacity and resistance considerations are fundamentally different. However, once you talk about protecting children from abuse, it's different. What matters to the family may not be in any way what matters to the child protection practitioner who has to protect the child from likelihood of significant harm, or what matters to the child in the long term. In child protection, we're essentially called to do two contradictory things at the same time, focusing on strengths whilst at the same time keeping an eye on deficiencies. Or should that be focusing on deficiencies but keeping an eye on strengths? Of course, having focused on deficiencies and identified them, we can address them by building on relevant strengths and other strengths.
So, Bruce, can you talk about these two things you mentioned, strengths and deficiencies?
We see the theme of strengths everywhere. We're reminded that all individuals and families have positives and succeed to find ways of achieving things for themselves. Of course, those things may not be exactly the same thing that agencies would want them to focus on or to achieve. But it demonstrates a capability or strength to achieve something. If we're able to identify strengths, and if we can build on that capability, we may be able to use it to help us achieve more positive outcomes. Who doesn't want to think of themselves as a practitioner having a great relationship with a family? Nobody wants to be seen as a disliked practitioner. Where there is so much conflict, you can't work with a family to achieve anything. We see strengths in legislation. In Wales, the 2014 Act and the 2020 safeguarding procedures, strengths are a cornerstone of the relationship we should be having with individuals. So organisations want to make this work in practice. It's in procedures and appears in assessment forms. And as an individual practitioner, who doesn't want to be working collaboratively, making a difference through brilliant relationships and changing things for the better for children?
Bruce, it sounds as if there's a but there somewhere.
The but, on the other hand, we may be scared of getting it wrong. So as practitioners, we're held in this practice tension. How do we work effectively with strengths, while at the same time being aware enough not to get caught out by being over-optimistic? And we are warned about the frightening consequences of making a mistake in child protection. We're told about disguised compliance, a scheming deception that may be there and will catch you out. So you may miss something, you may be tricked, you may make a mistake. These things weigh heavily on practitioners. I'm asked by practitioners, how do I guard myself from making mistakes with strengths and disguised compliance? I think there are a few things that can help. We see these in the ideas in effective child protection. Let's recap. When we talk about thresholds, we remind people that law gives us duties to investigate if we have reasonable cause to believe a child is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm. It's not optional. And to test the threshold, we look at what failure is, what it is that's causing harm to the child. This is focused on identifying a failure and a deficit. Realistically, that's what our main duties are in child protection. So I'm sorry, you can't get away from that. I'd go as far as to say it's desirable to focus on strengths. If you don't, you will be forgiven. Protecting children is not just desirable, It's essential. It's paramount. If you don't, you will not be forgiven. So you must identify abuse, but it's only desirable to identify strengths. Unfortunately, the things we have to test in child protection may be in direct contrast to finding strengths. For child protection to be effective, there needs to be change. To do this, you need to have effective relationships with families. In effective child protection, we see the skills of collaborative communication, and these always start with identifying strengths. And by starting with strengths, it sets the conversation positively and counteracts that focus on failure. But let's ask again, are all strengths the same? I don't think so. I think there's a danger that we try so hard to find strengths because we're expected to do so. Some call it strength collecting, a conscious bias towards finding strengths, possibly for some practitioners only because they have to or have to fill in a section on the form. If you look at a lot of guidance and training now, it's so focused on finding or gathering strengths. However, all strengths are not the same in child protection.
Earlier you used the term relevant strengths. What did you mean?
Some people find this distinction helpful. Don't think about strengths in child protection, but think about relevant strengths. What I mean is that the strength has to be relevant to the underlying concern. There's no point in just finding something positive if it has no relevance to all the issues that you worry about. It may help to think of it as one thing balancing another. So think of a playground seesaw or an old-fashioned set of weighing scales. On one side, you have the aspect of concern in the behaviour of the child or adult. For a strength to be relevant, it has to counteract or lessen the concern, balancing out. If I think of an example, let's say the parents have several hobbies. They're great gardeners. They enjoy family trips to the outdoors. If the overriding concern is that the father is domestically violent to his partner and the children are scared of him, strengths in gardening or family activities may not be relevant. Oh yes, I'm sure you're thinking now of ways they could be positive, of course, and you're imagining how this strength may be useful in a safeguarding plan. However, if you have gathered strengths and think this strength offsets the issues related to risk of domestic violence, then I ask you to reflect a little on this. There's a trap that finding strengths may make it difficult for you to see the safeguarding issue. If you identify strengths, ask yourself, are these relevant? My observation is that there is a lot of focus on strengths. It has a danger in that it is presented as the main answer to better practice. I am seeing a lot of emphasis on gathering strengths and a tendency to treat all strengths equally. However, I'm not seeing much to help practitioners manage the question of strengths in the world of child protection. I hope we don't develop practitioners who gather strengths just because they have to, in order to comply with expectations, without thinking if these are actually relevant. So, yes, start with strengths if you can, identify strengths, but always check. Are these relevant strengths to the child protection concern? Remember the seesaw of scales balancing out.
You mentioned disguised compliance earlier. Can you elaborate a little on this?
Yes, there is a lot more detailed guidance about this available in the practice resources, but I will make some connections. Disguised compliance is an intentional act on behalf, usually of the parents. This may be doing it consciously or even unconsciously because they've just learned this coping behaviour over the years. We need to be sure that we are not getting tricked by people's seemingly displayed compliance. How can we protect ourselves from this? I think effective child protection helps us in several ways. More importantly, it emphasises a focus on change. What has to improve is very clear. It is also limited to a few very clearly defined outcomes, so that stops us being unfocused, and that can happen in disguised compliance. So everyone knows what is expected and that we also have a way to measure progress. The measurement tool is called Steps to Change. It is a graded progress agreement with the family about each change, so this should keep momentum. In addition, you'll see that in the evidence of progress. It is suggested that workers make sure they understand the daily life of the child. Good practice tells us that understanding their day-to-day life stops us losing focus on the child, ensuring things change for the child and the workers don't get sidetracked with the parents' problems and difficulties. So, effective child protection model helps us with disguised compliance. Using steps focuses on change and looking at it from the daily life of a child, then if there is disguise compliance, that's going to be very obvious to any practitioner.
Bruce, have you any final comments about the way all of these things connect together?
The way things are connected together. I think I started by saying the strengths in child protection was different. I introduced the term relevant strengths that some people find useful. So effective child protection helps us with strengths, and in particular finding strengths that are relevant. When identifying what needs to change, remember, it's the deficiency that is linked to significant harm becomes the focus of change. Any strength that is relevant will be balanced against this. An obvious strength would be a real acknowledgement by the parent of the need to change. And in order to guard against disguise compliance, we keep focus and measure progress on very focused changes. Seen through the child's day-to-day life, it helps us embrace the focus on strengths, whilst also ensuring we meet our paramount responsibility to safeguard children. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.